Good evening, my name is Avafan, and in case you haven't already guessed from the t-shirt, tonight I'm going to be talking about the granddaddy of all roleplay games, and the only one to have both a live-action movie and a 1980s cartoon series. It is, of course, Dungeons and Dragons.
I got my 12-sided die, and I'm ready to roll with the wizard and my goblin crew. My friends are coming over to my mom's basement, bringing Funyuns and the Mountain Dew. I got a big broadsword made out of cardboard, and that stereo's a pumping Zeppelin. It's that time of the night, we turn on the black light, let the Dungeons and the Dragons begin. It's D&D, fighting with the legends of yore. It's D&D.
Now, Dungeons and Dragons is the game that even if you're not a gamer, you've almost certainly heard of. It's the game with the largest cultural impact. Referenced in countless shows, including The Big Bang Theory. Not bad for a game that was written in 1974. So how is a game that's over 40 years old and 5 editions later still so popular? Well, it's quite simple. At its core, D&D is, and always has been, a fantasy adventure game where you take control of a character in a fantasy world where you might encounter things like the undead, orcs, goblins, or even dragons. And as a fantasy game, you have your choice of races to play as well. You can play, as well as humans, elves, dwarves, halflings, half-elves, or even half-orcs. Now, if this at all sounds familiar to you, based on your experiences with the recent Hobbit and Lord of the Rings movies, then that's not hard to see why. D&D itself was heavily inspired by the writings of J.R.R. Tolkien, and has gone on to inspire probably countless other fantasy things as well. D&D almost certainly plays a heavy inspiration in the Elder Scrolls games, in the Warcraft series, and in particular World of Warcraft, and Games Workshop's Warhammer Fantasy. Its great strength with D&D is that it is a generic fantasy game, so it's open to a lot of ideas. In its original form, the character classes, or types of character, were loosely broken down into 4 main types. You had your warrior classes, who were the first in line when a fight kicks off. You've got your spellcasting classes, wizards and sorcerers who channel magic to weave their will upon the world. Priestly classes, such as the monk. No, not Kung Fu monks, before you think that Shaolin thing. No, I'm talking more sort of Dominican friars, Friar Tuck sort of characters. Or warrior priests, called clerics. And then you've got your rogues. Your rogues are your archetypal rule breakers, people who live by their own code. These are comprised up of thieves and travelling storytellers and all sorts of other colourful characters. And that sort of broadly makes up the 4 main types of character you'll see in D&D. Now, within each of those types of character, there are what are called classes. And this is one of the concepts that really kind of D&D established and is used in countless other roleplay games today, is the idea that some games you're just given a list of things to choose from to make your character. D&D makes it easier by having this class-based system. You pick a class, and your class gives you certain abilities. And then, as you progress through the game and gain more experience, you level up. And as you level up, you gain more automatic abilities through each level of your class. And it's these concepts of leveling up and classes that would go on to define the game, and countless other games that follow suit from that, really. So the game now has classes like the Barbarian, which is your archetypal sort of Viking-esque berserker, the wild man who goes into a frothing rage to smite his enemies down. Your fighter, who can be anything from a brawler to a trained soldier. The bard, a wandering storyteller, historian, minstrel, and general, well, bon vivant, shall we say. The cleric, a holy chaplain, if you will, charged with healing, protecting, and fighting for what his god believes in. Druids similarly channel divine energy, but from a more nature point of view. They can easily be mistaken for hippies, but would you really want to say that to anybody who has the ability to shapeshift into bears? Then, of course, there's your wizards, scholars who turn to books to learn a vast array of arcane and magical knowledge in order to cast spells. Your thieves, or rogues as they're now known, who are your con men, assassins, pickpockets, cat burglars, and pretty much everything in between. Rangers, solitary warriors in the woods, hunters, gamekeepers, and generally wilderness defenders. Paladins, who are your devout knights of a holy order, sworn to uphold chivalric code and protect the weak, and seek out and destroy evil wherever they encounter it. Then there's the sorcerer. He has magical powers similar to the wizard, but his powers are more innate, more from where he was born or his lineage. Some sorcerers claim to be descended of dragons, others claim to have had liaisons with fairies. Who knows, but that's where their power comes from. And these are the sorts of classes you have. You will, at the start of the game, will pick a race, pick a class, roll up a few stats. They've made it easier now to allocate your equipment. Before, you were given a long list of equipment and said, you might find all of these useful for the game. But in 5th edition, they've said, here are some examples of kit that you can start with for your class. You also gain more gold and equipment as the game goes on. Everything from the tools of your trade and lock picks and ropes and camping provisions through to weapons and armour. D&D has continued to evolve. The current iteration has a much more streamlined system. It also has a system called backgrounds, where you pick a short background and it gives you a couple of extra skills and some equipment, but it gives your character a little bit more depth. So perhaps your scholar was a soldier or a noble who took an interest in the arcane arts. Perhaps before becoming a fighter, your character was a criminal, or perhaps a merchant. These backgrounds add a little bit of flavour to your character. Other additions in the more recent version include things like a monk. Now this is your more Shaolin monk, which uses kind of the kung fu elements of a lot of things. As I said before, D&D is a anything goes fantasy, so whilst everything else in the game has that sort of pseudo-European medieval feel about it, you can have these sorts of outlandish characters, although I personally feel the monk doesn't quite fit. One of the other more recent additions, in particular in 5th Ed, is the Warlock, who again is another spellcaster, but unlike the sorcerer who has innate magic, or the wizard who devotes his life to scholarly pursuits, the sorcerer's decided I want to read that book, the really dusty one at the back of the library that I shouldn't be. And they go and they commune with otherworldly beings. And before you know it, you've gone and summoned Cthulhu, because they can be allied with fairies, demons, or even ancient gods. with impronounceable and unknowable names. The Warlock has probably less spells than the other classes, but he makes up for it by having lots of cool pact magic from his patron god, or patron spirit. The other thing that 5th edition, which is the current edition of Dungeons & Dragons, has done, is they've removed something called prestige classes, which used to exist in 3rd ed. And the prestige class was like a bonus class on top of your existing class. But the prestige classes had requirements, so in order to get these things, you had to be of a minimum level and have certain abilities, most of which required you to multi-class. Multi-classing was the idea that your character might dabble in multiple classes. So sometimes a wizard might want to learn how to swing a sword, so he might become a fighter. Or he might want to pick locks and become a rogue. Multi-classing is really cool and adds diversity, but it waters down the characters. So what they've done in 5th ed is they've added what they call archetypes. So at 3rd level your character picks an archetype. And these archetypes allow you to dabble a bit. Most of the archetypes give non-spell casting classes a little bit of spell power. So what was once a prestige class that would have been like a level 8 requirement, the Eldritch Knight, for instance, is now an option that fighters get at 3rd level. So your fighter can now be a fighter who can use a little bit of magic whilst in armour. Likewise, the sorcerer can gain a particular heritage which defines where his magic comes from and the things he can do with that magic. So these little tweaks have kind of really fleshed out the characters, which is just as well, because I think the character creation options under the previous edition, 4th ed, were arbitrary. Everything became very mechanical, and D&D has suffered over the years for being a little mechanic heavy. But now it's moved back in favour of giving you a little bit more to play with and giving a little bit more diversity. Unfortunately, D&D's greatest, shall we say, strength is also its greatest weakness, and that is that it's a generic fantasy. So, if a GM doesn't go in with a solid game plan, you can end up with all sorts of characters that don't necessarily mesh as well as they should. I played a game once where a lot of the party were very loose-moraled. They didn't care too much about following laws or murdering people. And the party included a tiefling assassin, which is a demon, which you can now play half demon. You can now play as a playable race in 5th ed. And he just wanted to murder things. There was a living golem. A My Little Pony paladin. That was just weird. And there I was trying to play a high elf sorcerer monk. And these characters were interesting on their own, but they just didn't mesh. D&D has some great spin-off settings, though, that kind of ground the game and add a little bit of a more distinct flavour. Things like Forgotten Realms has its own sort of distinct pantheon and politics within the various nations that exist there. There's Greyhawk, which is one of the sort of earliest and most definitive D&D settings. And again, although it's quite broad, there's still a lot of unique flavours to that. And probably one of the most interesting settings that D&D ever made was a series called Ravenloft, which was basically sort of Dungeons and Dragons does Hammer horror. It was like going up against Count Dracula. In fact, it pretty much was going up against Count Dracula. So you could go and do a sort of dark, gothic, vampire-inspired game. Of course, the unfortunate problem is that there are other games that do those things more specifically. I said before that D&D is the game we all know. It's the game we all know because a lot of us did start on D&D. Everybody in every gaming group if they themselves haven't played it, know somebody who has. I would say it's worth playing, and it's great to use as a springboard onto other things. D&D introduces ideas while still having certain board game elements about it. I said in my first video that most roleplay games don't use maps and miniatures, and you don't need them for D&D, but D&D is one of the games that kind of encourages that to a degree. Partly because the original D&D was written by people who were playing miniature war games, and at a time when miniature war games existed and roleplay games really didn't. So that is quite at the roots of where D&D is. Also now, whether you're a board gamer or not, one of the things that D&D's done in 5th ed, which I actually think is a stroke of genius, is they've got spell cards. I've got a set here of all of the spell cards you could possibly need for wizards and sorcerers. Which, as you can see, there are a lot of cards in there. Which, it does add a sort of another element of things you need to prepare for, and maybe a bit of the card gaming element that's quite popular now with Magic the Gathering and Pokemon cards, and whatever the popular card games are at the moment. But it's quite useful because it does save thumbing through the spellbook, which is a sizable portion of the player's guide. And that's the other problem with D&D. Most roleplay games are designed that one or two people at the table can have a copy of the main rulebook and you're good. But D&D has 3 main rulebooks. One just for players, one literally is just a list of monsters that you might encounter, and the other one is all of the additional treasure and tips and stuff that a dungeon master would need in order to run the game. I found that D&D is the one game where you'll turn up and almost every player will have a copy of the player's guide. And again, because every class has its own list of abilities and spells and things that you've got to keep tabs of, it does to a degree require that. D&D is not the mechanic heavy thing it was in the 2nd edition, but it can be daunting for new players coming in because there's a lot to learn. So in summary, would I recommend D&D? Yeah, I'd recommend D&D. It's worth giving it a go, and I always find myself every so often coming back to D&D. But I would always say to somebody who says they roleplay games and play D&D, say, that's cool, what else have you tried? Because there are a whole lot of other games out there, and if you only ever play D&D, well, you're missing out on a lot more interesting and diverse games out there. I hope this has been a useful explanation to you and to explain what D&D is, and I'm going to go on to explain on other games and give you a bit more of a lowdown on the other types of games, because believe it or not, there's a whole slew of games that don't involve fantasies and things that are based on Tolkien. Not that that's a bad thing. But if you found this video informative, give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to hear more about what I know and my experiences with roleplay games, there's a subscribe button just below. And as always, I've got links below to all of my social media, like Twitter, my Facebook page, and also my main YouTube channel, where I talk about all of the other nerdy things I do. Because apparently roleplay gaming isn't nerdy enough. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys soon.